Hello, my friend. Today I bring you another lost legend from the depths of Middle-earth. Close your eyes. Feel the magic surround you. Our journey begins.
The prophecy that predicted Smaug's awakening. Section 1. Shadowed Beginnings. In the deepening twilight of the Third Age, when the shadows grew long, and the memory of the elder days flickered like dying embers in the hearts of the wise, there came to Gandalf the Grey a vision that would trouble his dreams for years hence. It was in the halls of Rivendell, beneath the starlit dome where Elrond kept his most ancient scrolls, that he first read the words that would set in motion the wheels of fate. The parchment was old beyond reckoning, its edges brown as autumn leaves, written in the flowing script of Gil-galad's scribes in the days when the last alliance still burned bright in hope. Yet the words upon it spoke not of victory past, but of shadow yet to come. When the necromancer's hand grows strong in the south, the prophecy began, and the fastness of Dol Guldur casts its shadow long upon the wood, then shall the fire drake wake from golden slumber, and the mountain shall know wrath once more. Gandalf's weathered fingers traced the ancient runes, and in their curves and angles he saw the echo of things that were, and the warning of things that might yet be. The candlelight flickered, casting dancing shadows upon the walls, and for a moment it seemed as though the very darkness pressed closer, as if it too would read the words that had lain hidden for so many centuries. Outside the windows of the fair valley the night was deep and still, yet somewhere far to the south and east, where the greenwood grew dark beneath the weight of unseen malice, something stirred. Not yet the great and terrible form that would bring ruin to Esgaroth and desolation to the halls of Erebor, but the first breath of awakening, the first flutter of eyelids that had been closed in dreaming greed for 60 years. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, but to Gandalf's eyes they seemed dimmer now, as though a veil had been drawn across their light. In Dol Guldur, the necromancer's power waxed like a malignant moon, and its influence spread like poison through root and branch. The spiders grew larger and more cunning, the wolves more savage and bold. The very air grew thick with malice, until even the trees began to whisper of darker things than wind and rain. And in the north, where the lonely mountain stood proud and solitary against the sky, something that had long slumbered in halls filled with gold began to turn in its sleep. Dreams of fire and wrath flickered behind closed eyes, and deep in the mountain's heart, a great tale shifted among the treasure hoard, disturbing dust that had lain undisturbed since the fall of Dale. Section 2. A whisper in the trees. The greenwood was dying, not with the swift death that comes from flame or axe, but with the slow corruption that seeps through root and branch like a poison in the veins of the earth. Thranduil's sentries spoke in hushed voices of trees that wept black sap, of clearings where no bird would sing, of paths that led nowhere and yet seemed to call to unwary travellers with voices sweet as honey and cold as winter stone. It was in the month of Reether, when the first green shoots should have been breaking through the forest floor, that the Elven King's captain, Legolas, brought word to his father of a discovery that would chill even the immortal heart. Deep in the southern reaches of the wood, where the shadow of Dol Guldur fell longest, they had found a grove of malorn trees, those fair children of Lothlorien, withered and black, their golden leaves turned to ash that fell like snow in the windless air. "The corruption spreads, my lord," Legolas spoke, his voice heavy with grief that no mortal could fully comprehend. "Each day the shadow reaches further. The very song of the forest grows discordant, until even the Eldar find it painful to listen." Thranduil stood upon his terrace, gazing southward toward the distant fortress that brooded like a cancer upon the hill. His fair face, ageless as starlight, bore lines of care that had not been there in the days when Gil-galad's banner flew high and the hearts of elves were filled with hope. "The necromancer grows bold," he murmured, and his words carried the weight of centuries. "Too long have we watched and waited. Too long have we hoped that this evil might pass away like a storm in the night. In the deepest part of Mirkwood, where the trees grew so thick that noon was like twilight, and twilight like the depths of night, there dwelt one who had felt this change more keenly than any other. She was called the Whisper Keeper by those few who knew of her existence, neither elf nor mortal, but something older, a spirit of the wood itself that had taken form in the elder days when the world was young. The Whisper Keeper had tended the songs of the forest since before the first elves woke beneath the stars. She knew the voice of every tree, the dream of every flower, the secret name of every stream. But now, as she walked her ancient paths, she heard only silence where once there had been symphony, felt only cold where once there had been the warm pulse of growing life. It was she who first spoke the words that would echo through the halls of the wise. The sleeper in the mountain turns in his golden bed. The fire that was banked begins to smoulder. When the shadow reaches its full strength, when Dol Guldur's malice spreads like a blight across all the wood, then shall the dragon wake, and woe to those who dwell in the path of his wrath. Section 3. The Lone Rider. Through the misty downs that rolled like grey-green waves between the Shire and the wildlands beyond, a lone rider made his way beneath the uncertain light of a cloud-veiled sun. His horse's hooves struck soft earth and scattered stone with equal purpose, carrying him ever eastward toward a destination he would not name, even to himself, until the shadow of necessity made all paths clear. Gandalf the Grey rode as he always did, seeming unhurried yet covering ground with a persistence that spoke of deeper urgencies than haste could serve. His grey cloak billowed behind him like storm clouds, and his staff, thrust through the travelling gear behind his saddle, caught what little light filtered through the overcast sky and held it like captured starfire. It had been a fortnight since he left the halls of Rivendell, carrying with him the weight of the prophecy and the growing certainty that its hour was drawing near. The corruption in Mirkwood was spreading faster than even the Elder had foreseen. Reports reached him daily through the swift messengers of wind and wing. The old forest road was all but impassable now, choked with cobwebs thick as ship's rope, and haunted by creatures that had never known the light of sun or star. But it was not only the darkness in the wood that troubled his thoughts as he rode. There were other signs, more subtle but no less ominous. The weather had grown strange and fitful, summer storms that brought no rain, winter frosts that came without warning even in the warmth of spring. The birds spoke of unrest in their ancient tongues, and the very stones seemed to shift and settle, as if the earth itself grew restless. Most troubling of all were the dreams that came to him in the deep hours before dawn, dreams of fire rising from the depths of the mountain, of gold melting and running like water, of a great eye opening in the darkness and fixing its gaze upon the small and secret places where hope still dared to kindle. The road he followed was old beyond the memory of men, worn smooth by the passage of countless feet over ages uncounted. Here Gil-galad's armies had marched to their final victory and defeat. Here the refugees of Numenor had fled from the wreck of their drowned isle. Here, in days so distant they seemed like legend even to one who had witnessed their passing, the elves had first walked westward toward the sea, following a light that called to them from beyond the circles of the world. As the day wore toward evening, he began to feel the pull of Isengard drawing him southward, like a lodestone draws iron. There was knowledge there that he would need, lore that might illuminate the darker corners of the prophecy. And there was Saruman the White, whose wisdom in the matter of dragons was without equal among the Astari, whose counsel might prove invaluable in the trials that lay ahead. Section 4. Dol Guldur in the Distance. 3 days hence from his departure from the borders of the Shirelands, Gandalf stood upon the crest of a windswept hill that marked the southern bounds of the ancient realm of Rovanion. Below him, the land fell away in rolling waves of moor and meadow, crossed by silver streams that caught the morning light like threads of mithril woven through green cloth. Far to the southeast, rising like a dark tooth from the green canopy of Mirkwood, stood the hill of Dol Guldur. Even at this great distance, even beneath the clear light of morning, the fortress that crowned that hill seemed to gather shadows about itself like a cloak. No banner flew from its towers, no smoke rose from its halls, yet Gandalf felt its presence like a weight upon his heart, a darkness that pressed against the very edges of his perception. He had seen that fastness in the days of its building, when it was raised by hands that served the light and bore a name that spoke of silver starfire rather than sorcery and dread. Amon Lank, it had been called then, the Naked Hill, and fair it had been in its nakedness, crowned with towers of white stone that sang in harmony with the wind. Now the very air above Dol Guldur seemed thick and unwholesome, as if it carried the taint of some great corruption. Birds would not fly over it, and the trees that grew upon its slopes were twisted and dark, their leaves black even in the height of summer. The elves of Thranduil's realm had drawn back from its borders, abandoning ancient paths and fair dwellings to the creeping malice that spread from that accursed place like ripples from a stone cast into still water. Gandalf pulled his grey cloak more tightly about his shoulders, though the morning was warm and the wind gentle. The sight of Dol Guldur always chilled him, for he alone among the White Council suspected the true nature of the power that dwelt there. Not merely some hedge wizard drunk on petty malice, as Saruman insisted, but the Dark Lord himself, returned from the defeat that should have been his ending, growing strong again in the shadows while the wise debated and delayed. The prophecy spoke of this time, the season when the necromancer's hand would grow strong in the south. Already that strength was made manifest in the corruption of Mirkwood, in the spider-haunted paths where once the elves had walked in joy, in the silence that fell like a blight upon lands that had known song since the world's beginning. The wizard's weathered hand tightened upon his staff as he considered the implications. A dragon awakened was a force of destruction that few powers in Middle-earth could stand against. But perhaps that was the very purpose the necromancer intended. What need had the Dark Lord for armies and open war when a dragon's wrath could accomplish his ends more surely? Section 5. Into the Black. The assault upon Dol Guldur came not with the thunder of armies or the bright singing of steel, but with the soft tread of feet that had learned their stealth in the halls of Rivendell and the deep woods where even elven eyes might pass unseeing. Gandalf moved like a grey shadow through the twisted trees that choked the slopes of Amon Lanc, his staff muffled in cloth lest its light betray him to watching eyes. It had been 5 years since his meeting with Saruman in the Tower of Orthanc, 5 years since the White Wizard had shared his lore of dragonfire and the ways by which such creatures might be overcome. 5 years of careful preparation, of seeds planted and alliances forged, of the slow gathering of the company that would reclaim the mountain when the hour was ripe. The White Council had come at last to this place of shadow. Elrond rode with them, his fair face stern with resolution, and Galadriel, whose light seemed to press back the very darkness that clung to these accursed slopes. Radagast was there too, though he lingered at the borders of the wood tending to the beasts and birds that fled before the Council's advance. But it was Gandalf who entered the fortress first, slipping through passages that reeked of decay and malice, following paths that had once been fair galleries, where elven lords walked in the days of the realm's glory. The walls wept with a moisture that was not water, and the air itself seemed thick enough to choke upon. In the deepest dungeon of that accursed place, he found what he had come seeking. The cell was carved from living rock, its walls black with the stain of centuries, its floor littered with bones that spoke of torments too terrible for song, and there, chained with bonds of black iron that burned with their own fell fire, hung a figure that had once been mighty among the kings of men. Thrain, Gandalf whispered, and the name echoed in the darkness like a prayer for the dead. The dwarf king raised his head with effort that spoke of strength nearly spent, and his eyes, once bright as stars, were filmed with the madness that comes to those who have looked too long upon despair. His beard, once golden as autumn wheat, was now white as winter frost, and his body bore the marks of long torment. "Grey Wizard," Thrain spoke, and his voice was like the rustle of dry leaves. "Have you come to mock my folly or to witness my ending? Long have I waited in this place of shadow, and long have I paid the price for my pride." With careful fingers, the wizard began to search the walls of the cell, feeling for the stone that might yield to pressure. Behind a stone marked with the ancient runes of Durin's house, wrapped in oiled leather, lay 2 treasures that would change the fate of the North. A key of silver and steel and a map drawn on skin that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Section 6. The Captive King. In the clean light of morning that followed the cleansing of Dol Guldur, when the shadow had fled like mist before the sunrise and the twisted trees began, perhaps to dream of growing straight once more, Gandalf knelt beside the freed form of Thrain, son of Thror, and listened to the ravings of a king whose mind had been shattered by years of torment. The dwarf lay upon a bed of moss and fallen leaves that Radagast had gathered, breathing shallow as a bird's but breathing still. His body bore the marks of long captivity, scars that spoke of tortures both subtle and crude, flesh wasted until the bones showed sharp beneath skin that had once been ruddy with health. "The dragon," Thrain whispered, his voice thin as autumn wind through bare branches. "I hear him breathing, always breathing, in the deep places where the gold runs like water. He dreams of fire, dreams of flight, dreams of the day when the mountain shall burn again." Galadriel approached with steps as soft as falling snow, her light seeming to ease the shadows that clung even now about the broken king. "Peace, Lord of Erebor. The darkness is lifted, and you are free at last from the necromancer's malice." But Thrain turned his face away from her radiance, as if even kindness had become too bright for eyes that had known only shadow. "Free?" he laughed, and the sound held no mirth. "What freedom is there for one who has seen the future written in dragon flame? I have walked in the necromancer's dreams, fair lady. I have seen the fires that will come." Elrond knelt opposite Gandalf, his hands glowing with the light of healing, though even his skill could do little for hurts of the mind and spirit. "What did you see, son of Thror? What visions did the enemy show you in your captivity?" The dwarf's eyes fixed suddenly on the elf lord's face, and for a moment clarity returned to his gaze like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "I saw the mountain burning," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I saw the lake turn to steam, and the town of men consumed in fire and flood. I saw my people scattered like leaves before the hurricane of the dragon's wrath. And I saw small hands in darkness reaching for something that burned with its own fire." His voice broke then, and tears streamed down his weathered cheeks. "The necromancer showed me these things night after night, year upon year. He whispered that this was the price of my pride, the doom that would fall upon all who bore the blood of Durin." Section 7. The Necromancer's Voice. In the depths of Barad-dûr, where the foundations were laid with malice and the walls built from the shaped despair of ages, a shadow that had no name spoke with a voice that had forgotten the music of creation. The necromancer had fled from Dol Guldur, but the necromancer was only a mask, a lesser form assumed for convenience and concealment. The assault upon his southern stronghold had been expected. Indeed, it had been welcomed. For too long the White Council had debated and delayed, content to watch and worry while his strength grew in shadow. Their attack, when it finally came, was as much a relief as a setback. "Let them believe they have won a victory," the Dark Lord mused, his voice echoing through chambers that had not heard such words since the downfall of Númenor. "Let them think that Dol Guldur was my stronghold, that its loss has weakened me. They know not that it was but an outpost, a finger extended to feel the pulse of their resistance." The nine stirred in their alcoves, wraith forms flickering between substance and shadow as their master's will pressed upon them. They had served him faithfully through the long years of exile and diminishment, and now their patience would be rewarded. Sauron turned his thought northward, reaching out with senses that could perceive the beating of a sparrow's heart at 1,000 miles, or the stirring of malice in the deepest pits of the earth. There, beneath the lonely mountain, Smaug the Mighty lay coiled upon his bed of gold, dreaming the slow dreams that came to dragons in their times of rest. "Sleep grows light, Ancient One," Sauron whispered across the leagues that separated them. "The gold beneath you shifts and settles, and in that shifting you hear the footsteps of thieves who would dare your wrath. Wake, Fire Drake. Wake and remember the taste of fear, the music of lamentation that your kind has always loved." The dragon stirred at that dark whisper, his great tail thrashing among the coins and cups that carpeted his lair. In his dreams, he saw shadows creeping through passages he had thought sealed, small forms moving with the stealth of those who knew they trespassed upon his domain. But Smaug did not wake, not yet. The dreams were strong, but 60 years of slumber could not be shaken off in a single night. He turned upon his golden bed and settled deeper into sleep, though now that sleep was shot through with visions of fire and vengeance. Section 8. Fire in the Darkness. The battle came without warning, erupting like a thunderclap in the depths of Dol Guldur's highest tower. Gandalf the Grey stood alone in the chamber where shadows had ruled for centuries, his staff blazing with light that cut through the darkness like a sword through silk. Before him, wreathed in malice that made the very air thick and poisonous, The necromancer revealed at last the true extent of his power. "Mithrandir," the shadow spoke, and its voice was like the grinding of millstones, like the whisper of wind through graveyards. "Long have you meddled in affairs beyond your understanding. Did you think your light could banish what was old when the world was young?" Gandalf raised his staff higher, and the light that blazed from its crystal head pushed back the encroaching darkness by mere inches. "I know you now for what you are, Sauron the Deceiver. Your disguise fools none who have eyes to see. The White Council comes to cleanse this place, and your long hiding is at an end." The Dark Lord's laughter shook the very foundations of the tower, sending cascades of dust and mortar raining down upon the combatants. "Cleanse," he mocked. "You understand nothing, grey fool. This place was never my stronghold. It was my gift to you, a bone thrown to dogs to keep them content while the true work proceeded elsewhere." With a gesture, Sauron sent waves of shadow crashing against Gandalf's light like black water against a lighthouse. The wizard staggered under the assault, his staff's radiance flickering as darkness pressed in from all sides. "You feel it now," Sauron continued, his form beginning to solidify into something that hurt to look upon directly. "The weight of years, the burden of your endless meddling. You are old, Mithrandir, and I am eternal. Your light grows weak while my darkness spreads across all the world." But even as the shadow pressed closer, Gandalf found strength he had not known he possessed. The light of his staff flared brighter, fed not by his own power alone but by something greater, the memory of the flame imperishable that had kindled the first stars. "You speak of darkness as if it were strength," the wizard replied, his voice ringing clear despite the shadow that pressed about him. "But darkness is nothing more than the absence of light, and light." The crystal atop his staff blazed like a captive star. Light needs only the smallest spark to banish even the deepest night. The shadow began to withdraw, flowing back into the depths of the tower like black water down a drain. But as it retreated, Sauron's voice echoed through the chamber with a promise that chilled Gandalf's heart. "The dragon wakes, Mithrandir. Even now he stirs in his golden bed, and when he rises, the north will burn." Section 9. Return to the Wise. The halls of Rivendell had not known such urgency for an age of the world. Where once the last homely house had been a place of quiet contemplation and gentle healing, now it hummed with the barely contained tension of great events set in motion. Elrond's council chamber, which had hosted countless peaceful gatherings over the centuries, now bore witness to debates that would shape the fate of Middle-earth. Gandalf stood before the assembled members of the White Council, his grey robe still bearing the scorch marks of his battle with the necromancer. In his hands he held the key and map recovered from Dol Guldir's depths, and in his eyes burned a light that spoke of desperate resolve. "The Dark Lord has returned," he declared, his voice carrying across the chamber like the toll of a great bell. "Not in the full might of his former power, but in strength enough to threaten all that we hold dear. Even now he gathers his forces in Mordor, and the shadows grow long across the lands of the free." Saruman the White sat in the place of honour at Elrond's right hand, his pale eyes fixed upon his fellow wizard with an expression of what might have been concern. "You speak with great certainty, Mithrandir," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Yet the being we faced in Dol Guldur, mighty though it was, gave no clear sign of being the Dark Lord himself." "I know what I faced, Saruman. The power that stood before me in that tower was no mere echo. It was Sauron himself, though in diminished form. He admitted as much, and spoke of the ring that still binds his strength." At the mention of the ring, a hush fell over the chamber. The One Ring was a name spoken rarely and with reluctance among the wise, for its very existence was a source of despair to those who understood its true nature. "The ring is lost," Elrond said quietly. "Lost these many centuries past when Isildur perished in the waters of Anduin. If it still exists, it lies hidden in darkness where no searching can find it." "Yet the Dark Lord believes it will be found," Gandalf replied. He spoke of it stirring in its hiding place, drawn by forces that even its bearer cannot resist. The debate that followed would be remembered long in the annals of the wise, for it marked the moment when the path toward the War of the Ring was finally chosen. It was Elrond who finally broke the deadlock, his voice carrying the weight of ages and the wisdom of one who had seen the rise and fall of kingdoms. "In the end," he said slowly, "the choice is not ours to make. The wheel of fate has already begun to turn, and we can only hope to guide its course rather than control it. If the dragon is to wake regardless of our wishes, then let us ensure that his waking serves the light rather than the shadow. Section 10. Stirring the North. The prancing pony in Bree had seen many strange meetings in its long years of service to travellers from all corners of Middle-earth, but few as momentous as the one that took place on a rain-swept evening in the month of Thrimmage. In a private room above the common hall, Gandalf the Grey sat across from a figure whose very presence seemed to darken the shadows in the corners of the chamber. Thorin Oakenshield, son of Thrain, son of Thror, heir to the throne of Erebor, was a dwarf lord diminished by exile but not broken by it. His dark hair and beard were streaked with silver that spoke of sorrows beyond his years, and his eyes held the particular fire that burned in those who had lost everything save their pride and their determination to reclaim it. "You speak of impossibilities, Grey Wizard," Thorin said, his voice carrying the weight of old grief and older anger. "The dragon sleeps upon a bed of gold that was my inheritance, in halls that rang once with the songs of my people. What force in Middle-earth could drive him from his lair?" Gandalf leaned forward, his weathered hands spread upon the table between them. The key and map lay there like pieces of hope made manifest, their surfaces gleaming in the candlelight with promise and peril intertwined. Not an army, Lord of Erebor, not the clash of steel or the thunder of cavalry. Dragons are not defeated by force of arms alone. They are creatures of greed and pride, and it is through those very traits that they may be undone. The wizard's fingers traced the ancient runes that marked the secret door upon the map, each symbol a word in the tongue of Durin's folk that spoke of hidden ways and forgotten passages. "Your father left you more than royal blood and bitter memories, Thorin Oakenshield. He left you the means to enter the mountain unseen, to walk halls that Smaug believes secure beyond all possibility of breach." "A burglar's entrance," Thorin muttered, his voice thick with distaste. "You would have the heir of Durin creep like a thief into his own inheritance." "I would have the heir of Durin be wise enough to use every weapon at his disposal," Gandalf replied firmly. "Pride is a luxury that exiles cannot afford, and kingship that is never reclaimed is worth less than the dust beneath our feet." Thorin's gaze fixed upon the map with an intensity that spoke of longing deeper than the roots of mountains. Here was the dream that had sustained him through 60 years of wandering, the hope that had burned in his heart when all other lights had failed. 12 companions, perhaps, Gandalf continued, sworn to follow their rightful king on the greatest adventure of the age. Section 11. A Hobbit Remembered. In the gentle rolling hills of the Shire, where the grass grew green as emeralds and the flowers bloomed in wild profusion along every lane and hedgerow, spring had come with particular sweetness to the gardens of Bag End. Bilbo Baggins stood in his doorway on that most fateful of mornings, breathing deep of air that carried the scent of growing things and the promise of long, peaceful days ahead. He was a hobbit of comfortable middle years, well set in his ways and content with a life that revolved around the simple pleasures of good food, fine pipeweed, and the gentle turning of the seasons. His round face bore the cheerful expression of one who had never known want or danger, and his green vest and yellow waistcoat spoke of prosperity earned through careful management rather than daring adventure. Yet for all his contentment, Bilbo found himself troubled by a restlessness he could not name. It had begun some weeks past, this strange feeling that something was missing from his well-ordered existence, that beyond the familiar boundaries of the Shire lay a world vast and full of wonders he had never imagined. The feeling was strongest when he stood at his gate in the early morning, looking down the road that wound away eastward toward lands he knew only from the stories his mother used to tell. Belladonna Took had been her name before she married his father, and the Tooks were known throughout the Shire for their peculiar habit of disappearing without warning and returning with tales that shocked and delighted their neighbours. "Must be the Took in me," Bilbo muttered to himself as he pottered about his garden. "Mother always said it would surface eventually, that wandering spirit that seems to run in her family like a fever." But even as he spoke the words, he felt a little thrill of something that might have been excitement. What if the Took blood did indeed run stronger in his veins than he had supposed? What if there was more to Bilbo Baggins than anyone, including himself, had ever suspected? He had felt something similar on the morning his father died, and again on the day his mother passed. That sense of standing at the edge of a great change, of life preparing to shift in ways that could not be foreseen or prevented. But this feeling was different, charged not with sorrow but with possibility, as if adventure itself was drawing near on feet too light to hear. It was while he was thus engaged in the hopeless task of banishing adventure from his thoughts that Bilbo first noticed the wizard. The figure appeared at the top of the hill that overlooked Bag End, tall and grey and somehow familiar, though Bilbo was certain he had never seen the man before. For a moment their eyes met across the distance that separated them, and in that moment Bilbo felt the last of his ordinary life slipping away like sand through his fingers. The wizard began to make his way down the hill with measured steps, his staff tapping against the stone of the road with a rhythm that seemed to echo the beating of Bilbo's suddenly racing heart. Section 12. The plan set in motion. The Green Dragon Inn in Bywater had never hosted such a gathering as the one that took place on the night when 13 dwarves descended upon the Shire like a small avalanche of beards, axes and righteous indignation. They came by twos and threes throughout the evening, having travelled by different routes from the Blue Mountains to avoid drawing attention. In the inn's largest private room, where the fire burned bright and the ale flowed freely, Thorin Oakenshield held court like the king he had been born to be. His kinsmen had answered his call with the loyalty that was bred in their bones, leaving behind comfortable homes and profitable crafts to follow their lord on a quest that most folk would have dismissed as the dream of a madman. Balin the Wise sat at Thorin's right hand, his white beard gleaming in the firelight as he studied the ancient map with eyes that had seen the glory of Erebor in the days before its fall. Beside him, his brother Dwalin sharpened his axes with methodical care. The younger dwarves, Fili and Kili, Orion, Nori and Dori, Bifur and Boffer and Bomber, clustered around their leaders like eager students. 13 of us, Thorin said, his voice carrying easily over the low murmur of conversation. 13 sons of Durin who will walk the road to the mountain and reclaim what was stolen from our fathers. It is a good number, not so large as to attract unwanted attention, not so small that we lack the strength to seize opportunity when it comes. 14, Gandalf corrected gently from his place by the hearth. 14, if our burglar proves willing to join us. At the mention of their mysterious 14th companion, the dwarves exchanged glances that ranged from curious to sceptical. They had heard much about this burglar in the weeks of preparation, but none had yet laid eyes upon the creature that Gandalf claimed would be essential to their success. A hobbit, Glóin muttered, stroking his red beard with obvious doubt. A soft creature of the Shire lands, who has never seen battle or faced danger greater than a flooded garden. How can such a being aid us in our quest? As if summoned by the wizard's words, a knock came at the door. Not the bold rap of one who demands entrance, but the hesitant tapping of someone who half hopes to be turned away. Through the open door came a figure that seemed almost comically small beside the company of warriors. Bilbo Baggins entered the room with the careful steps of one who knows he is walking into a situation far beyond his understanding. His round face bore an expression of mingled curiosity and terror, and his hands shook slightly as he removed his hat. The plan that took shape that night was born of desperation and hope in equal measure, a gamble that would either restore the kingdom under the mountain or end in death for all who attempted it. They would travel by secret ways to the lonely mountain, using the map and key to enter through the hidden door. The hobbit would scout ahead, learning what he could of the dragon's habits and defences. Section 13. The Fire Awakens. Deep beneath the lonely mountain, in chambers vast enough to hold armies yet filled with naught but silence and the cold gleam of hoarded gold, something stirred that had not truly moved for 60 years. Smaug the Mighty, the chiefest and greatest of calamities, last of the great fire drakes of the north, began the slow process of awakening from the long sleep that had held him since the destruction of Dale and the conquest of Erebor. It began, as dragon wakings always did, with dreams, vast, sweeping visions that spoke to the creature's deepest nature and most fundamental desires. Dreams of fire rolling across green fields like a tide of molten gold, of cities burning bright as festival candles in the darkness of night. Dreams of terror and dominion, of small folk fleeing before the thunder of mighty wings and the roar of flames that could melt stone and boil rivers dry. But threaded through these familiar visions of destruction were others, stranger and more troubling. Dreams of small shadows creeping through passages that should have been empty, of whispers in the darkness that spoke of ancient rights and older wrongs. Dreams of 13 figures walking the long road to the mountain, their hearts filled with purpose that burned as bright as dragonfire. The great dragon's eye opened, one eye only, for true wakefulness was still many hours away, and gazed out across the sea of treasure that surrounded him like a golden ocean. Every coin, every cup, every precious stone was exactly where it should be, arranged in the patterns that only a dragon's perfect memory could maintain. Yet something was wrong, some disturbance in the harmony of his hoard that set his ancient nerves on edge. Gold. Gold was missing from his treasure, though the amount was too small for mortal senses to detect. A cup here, a handful of coins there, theft so minor that they would have escaped the notice of any save one whose life was built upon the perfect knowledge of every gleaming object in his possession. "Thief," he rumbled, his voice like distant thunder echoing through the mountain's roots. "Some fool has dared to steal from Smaug the Mighty. Some miserable creature has crept into my halls and touched what is mine by right of conquest." The word thief rolled around the vast chamber like a curse given form, stirring the air until the coins nearest to the dragon's head began to chime with a sound like distant bells. It was a word that touched the very core of dragon nature, for to steal from a dragon was to commit the gravest sin imaginable. But even as rage began to build in Smaug's ancient heart, wisdom born of centuries whispered caution. The missing gold was old theft, if theft it was. The coins had been gone for years, perhaps decades. Why then did he dream of it now? Why did visions of small shadows and creeping figures fill his sleep with such vivid intensity? Something was coming. The dragon's senses, honed by ages of vigilant guarding, felt it approaching like a storm front rolling across the sky. Not armies. He would have sensed the tramp of many feet, the clash of steel and the smell of fear that attended such gatherings. This was something smaller, more subtle, yet somehow more dangerous for its very quietness. "Let them come," Smaug whispered, his words carrying the heat of barely banked fires. "Let thieves and heroes venture forth to face the last of the great fire drakes. They will learn why songs are still sung of dragon wrath, why even the memory of my kind fills the hearts of mortals with terror." The dragon began to shift upon his golden bed, causing avalanches of coins to cascade down the slopes of his treasure hoard with a sound like metallic rain. Each movement was deliberate, calculated to test limbs that had remained still for too long, to wake muscles that would soon be called upon to deal death from the sky. Far above, in the upper reaches of the mountain where the wind howled through broken halls and empty chambers, birds took flight in sudden panic. The very stones began to warm with heat that rose from the depths, and those with the wisdom to read such signs would have known that the dragon's awakening had begun in earnest. Smaug's second eye opened, and the chamber filled with a baleful light that had not been seen since the day he first claimed the mountain as his own. The fire was awakening indeed, and before its wrath was spent, the North would know whether the last of the fire drakes was truly as mighty as the songs claimed. Section 14. A blade not yet drawn. In the depths of Moria, where darkness had reigned absolute since the dwarves fled before the terror they had, awakened from the depths, something stirred that had slumbered even longer than the dragon in his mountain halls. The Balrog, that ancient demon of shadow and flame, felt the shifting of the world's balance like a tremor in the earth's bones, and for the first time in centuries it lifted its great head from the rocky pillow where it had rested. The creature had been content to drowse in the deep places, feeding on the heat of the earth's core and the slow anger that smouldered in abandoned halls. But now the patterns of power were changing, and the demon sensed opportunity in the winds that blew through the empty corridors of Khazad-dûm. In the misty mountains, where goblins had delved their own twisted realm in mockery of the dwarves' ancient works, the great goblin felt a summons in his black heart that he had not known for many a long year. The time of hiding was ending, and those who served the shadow must prepare to play their part in the great war that was to come. Armies began to gather in the high passes, moving with the stealth that came naturally to creatures that had learned to fear the light. Wargs howled in the night, calling their packs together for hunts that would range far from their mountain lairs. In the depths of Dol Guldur, now cleansed of its master's presence but not yet free of his influence, spiders large as horses began to spin webs that stretched between the trees like nets designed to catch more than flies. And in Isengard, in the Tower of Orthanc, where Saruman the White maintained his vigil over the borders of Rohan, the fallen wizard felt the stirring of forces that he had thought to control, but which now moved to patterns not of his devising. The plan had been simple: let the dragon wake, let heroes come to face it, and in the chaos that followed, let greater schemes proceed unnoticed while all eyes were fixed upon the mountain. "The dragon stirs too soon," Saruman muttered as he stood in his high chamber, gazing eastward through the palantir that connected him to his master's will. "The company has not yet reached the mountain. The stage is not yet set for the tragedy I have prepared." In the depths of the Seeing Stone, Sauron's presence made itself known like fire glimpsed through dark water. "Patience, my servant. The awakening proceeds as I have foreseen, though perhaps not as you have planned. Let the fire drake wake. His wrath will serve our purpose, whether it destroys heroes or drives them to desperate acts of courage." "But if they succeed," Saruman protested, "if the dragon is slain and the mountain reclaimed, it will inspire others to similar acts of defiance. The free peoples may unite against us before we are ready for open war." The Dark Lord's laughter echoed through the palantir like the sound of breaking glass. Let them unite, if they can. Let them gather their armies and speak brave words of alliance. When the hour comes for my return, when the ring is restored to my hand, all there, courage will be as dust before the hurricane of my wrath. The blade was not yet drawn, but already the hand that would wield it was closing around the hilt. The dragon's awakening was but the first note in a symphony of war that would shake the very foundations of Middle-earth before its final chord was played. In the Shire, where peace still reigned and the worst concerns were matters of weather and harvest, a certain hobbit sat by his fire and tried to convince himself that the tremor he felt in his bones was nothing more than the approach of a thunderstorm. Section 15. The Kingdom Reclaimed. The great gates of Erebor swung open for the first time in 60 years, their ancient hinges groaning in protest as they yielded to the strength of dwarven hands that had dreamed of this moment through all the long years of exile. Thorin Oakenshield stood upon the threshold of his inheritance, his eyes bright with triumph and terrible with the weight of all that had been lost and reclaimed. Behind him lay the greatest adventure of the age, a journey that had taken him and his companions through perils that would be sung of until the world's end. They had faced trolls in the wildlands and goblins in the mountain passes. They had walked in halls where spiders large as horses spun webs from shadow and malice. They had stood before the dragon himself, and through courage and cunning and no small measure of luck, they had emerged victorious. Smaug the Mighty was dead, his reign of fire and terror ended by a black arrow loosed from the bow of a man whose name would be remembered when the deeds of kings were forgotten. The lake town of Esgaroth was rebuilt upon the waters, stronger and fairer than before. The men of Dale had returned to their ancient city, raising new walls upon the foundations of the old. But victory, Thorin had learned, carried its own burdens. The kingdom under the mountain was his now by right of blood and conquest, but it was a kingdom that bore the scars of dragonfire and the weight of expectations that seemed almost too great to bear. "My lord," Balin said softly, "the throne room awaits. Your people have prepared a ceremony worthy of the return of their king." Thorin nodded, but his eyes remained fixed upon the vista that spread before him, the desolation that Smaug had wrought upon the lands around the mountain, the slow work of healing that would take generations to complete. Where once green fields had stretched to the horizon, now only broken stone and ash-covered earth remained. 60 years, the king murmured, 60 years of desolation, and still the scars remain. How does one rebuild not just a kingdom, but hope itself? It was Bilbo who answered, the small hobbit stepping forward with the quiet courage that had served them all so well. "One stone at a time, I should think. That's how the Shire was built after all. One field, one garden, one comfortable hobbit hole at a time. Great things. Have small beginnings, and perhaps the rebuilding will prove easier than the reclaiming." As they made their way through the halls toward the throne room, past chambers that rang with the sound of dwarven voices raised in celebration, Thorin found his thoughts turning to the prophecy that had set these events in motion. 3 companies, the ancient words had said, one to cleanse the south, one to reclaim the north, and one small beyond measure to bear a burden that would determine all. The first two companies had done their work. Dol Guldur stood empty of its malice. Erebor was reclaimed. But what of the third company? What burden did the prophecy speak of? And who would be called to bear it? The answer, he suspected, lay with the small figure who walked beside him. Bilbo Baggins, whose courage had proved greater than his stature. The hobbit had found more than gold in the dragon's hoard. He had found something that gleamed with its own inner fire, something that seemed to pulse with power beyond mortal comprehension. In the throne room, where light streamed through windows that had been dark since the day of Smaug's coming, the crown of the Mountain Kings awaited its rightful wearer. As the crown settled upon Thorin's brow, as the voices of his people rose in songs of celebration, the new king felt the weight of destiny settling upon his shoulders. Section 16. A Ring Still Sleeps. In the quiet hours after the celebration had ended and the halls of Erebor had settled into peaceful silence, Bilbo Baggins sat alone in the chamber that had been prepared for him, turning a simple golden ring over and over in his fingers. The metal was warm to the touch, warm with more than body heat, and in the firelight it seemed to pulse with a life of its own. He had found it in the deepest tunnels beneath the misty mountains, in darkness so complete that even the ring's strange luminescence had been swallowed by shadow. A chance discovery during their flight from the goblins, when desperate hands had grasped at anything that might serve as weapon or tool. The ring had powers. He had discovered that much during their adventures. It could make the wearer invisible, could grant the ability to walk unseen among enemies, or slip past watchers whose vigilance was absolute. It had saved his life more times than he could count, had allowed him to rescue his companions from certain doom. But it was not the ring's usefulness that troubled him now. It was the way it seemed to whisper to him in the darkest hours before dawn, the way his hand would stray to it whenever his mind wandered, the growing certainty that this simple band of gold was anything but simple. Sometimes, when he wore it for too long, he found himself thinking thoughts that were not his own, dreams of dominion and power, visions of enemies prostrate before his will, fantasies of strength that could reshape the world according to his desires. The thoughts were seductive, more dangerous than any dragon's fire. "You are its master now," the voice would whisper. "All the power of the earth is yours to command. Why should one so small remain forever small? Why should one so wise continue to serve the whims of larger folk?" But in the morning light, such thoughts seemed like fever dreams, products of exhaustion and strain. Bilbo would remove the ring and place it carefully in its hiding place, and the whispers would fade. Yet they always returned, growing stronger with each passing day. A soft knock at his door interrupted these troubling thoughts, and Bilbo quickly slipped the ring onto his finger before calling for his visitor to enter. The door opened to reveal Gandalf, his grey robes seeming to gather all the shadows in the room. "Still awake, my dear fellow?" the wizard asked, though his eyes were fixed not on Bilbo, but on the spot where the hobbit sat, as if he could sense something hidden despite the ring's power. "I find sleep difficult after such excitement," Bilbo replied, slipping the ring off his finger with casual ease. Too many thoughts, too many questions without answers. Gandalf's gaze sharpened as the hobbit became visible once more, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes that might have been suspicion. "Questions are the beginning of wisdom," he said slowly. "Tell me, what questions trouble your rest on this night of victory?" Bilbo hesitated, his hand moving instinctively toward the ring before he caught himself. How could he explain the whispers in the darkness, the dreams of power that came in the small hours? How could he speak of the growing certainty that the ring was more than it seemed? "I find myself wondering about the future," he said finally. "About what comes after adventure, when the dragon is slain and the treasure won. Do the heroes simply return to their comfortable lives?" The wizard studied him with eyes that seemed to see far more than they revealed. "Some do, but others find that adventure has changed them in ways they did not expect, has awakened hungers that comfortable fires cannot satisfy." "And which sort am I?" Bilbo asked. "That remains to be seen," Gandalf replied. "But I suspect your greatest adventure may still lie ahead. The ring you found in the goblin tunnels, there is more to it than mere invisibility, is there not?" The question hung in the air between them, and Bilbo felt his heart racing. To keep such a secret had been a burden heavier than he had realized, and part of him longed to share it with someone whose wisdom might make sense of the mystery. But even as he opened his mouth to speak, The ring seemed to pulse with heat, and the voice spoke again. "Trust no one with this secret. Power shared is power lost." "It's just a magic ring," Bilbo said quickly. "Useful for hiding when discretion is called for, but nothing more than that." Gandalf's expression did not change, but something in his eyes suggested he had heard far more than Bilbo intended to reveal. "Perhaps, but magic has a way of growing more complex with time. Promise me, if the ring begins to change, you will seek counsel." "Of course," Bilbo agreed, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. "Though I'm sure there's nothing to worry about, it's just a ring after all." But even as he spoke, he could feel the weight of the golden band in his pocket, could sense its presence like a small sun that cast no light, but radiated heat that went deeper than flesh and bone. It was not just a ring, and they both knew it. Section 17. The enemy withdraws. The cleansing of Dol Guldur had been thorough, its malice scoured away by fire and starlight until only empty stone remained where shadow once held dominion. Yet, as Gandalf walked through the abandoned halls for the final time, his staff casting circles of clean light upon walls that had wept with corruption, he could not shake the feeling that their victory was somehow incomplete. The necromancer had fled, yes, fled so swiftly that his departure left only echoes in the chambers where his power had once festered like an open wound. But flight was not defeat, and Gandalf had lived too long in the world to mistake the temporary withdrawal of evil for its permanent banishment. "The southern fortress is cleansed," Elrond said, as he joined Gandalf in what had once been the necromancer's throne room. "Yet I feel no peace in this victory. The shadow has not been destroyed, merely displaced." "Displaced to Mordor," Gandalf replied grimly, "where it has always belonged, where it can gather its true strength without the need for concealment. We have cleansed this place, yes, but in doing so we have driven the enemy to ground that is far more dangerous." The irony was bitter as wormwood. The White Council had acted at last, had overcome years of debate and delay to strike at what they believed was the heart of the growing darkness. Yet their very success had served the enemy's purpose better than continued inaction might have done. In Barad-dûr, the dark tower that had stood empty since the downfall of the last alliance, ancient forges were burning once more. Orc armies were gathering in the land of shadow, breeding in the pits beneath Mount Doom until their numbers darkened the very air. The Nine were stirring in their barrows, preparing to ride forth again upon the wind. The dragon's awakening served his purpose well, Gandalf continued. While all eyes were fixed upon the mountain, while heroes ventured forth to face fire and claw, the real enemy worked in shadow to prepare for open war. Smaug was never more than a distraction. "Yet the dragon's death was not without value," Elrond replied. "The kingdom under the mountain is restored, the dwarves have returned to their ancient halls, and the free peoples have been reminded that even the mightiest servants of shadow can be overcome." True, and perhaps that was part of the enemy's calculation as well. Let the free peoples taste victory, let them grow confident in their strength, and they will be less prepared for the storm that is gathering in the east. As they made their way from the cleansed fortress, Gandalf found his thoughts turning to the small figure who had played such a crucial role in the dragon's defeat. Bilbo Baggins had returned to his comfortable hole in the Shire, bearing with him memories of adventure that would colour all his remaining days. But he had also brought something else, something that pulsed with power in the darkness of his hidden chambers, the ring. Gandalf had suspected its nature from the moment he glimpsed it upon the hobbit's finger, had felt the echo of ancient malice that clung to its golden surface like a stain that could never be cleansed. Yet he had said nothing, done nothing, held back by doubts and fears that he was only now beginning to understand. If the ring was indeed what he suspected, if it was the One Ring of legend, then its presence in the Shire was both the greatest hope and the greatest danger that Middle-earth had known since the Elder Days. "We must watch and wait," Gandalf said aloud. "The enemy has withdrawn, but he has not been defeated. His true test is yet to come, and when it does, all our carefully laid plans may prove as fragile as spider's silk." Behind them, Dol Guldur stood empty beneath the growing light of day, its towers broken and its halls scoured clean of malice. But the victory felt hollow, incomplete, like the first movement of a symphony that promised discord in its final chords. In the distance, where the borders of Mirkwood still struggled against corruption that centuries could not easily heal, a single raven took flight. Its wings bore it eastward, toward the mountains that ringed the land of shadow, carrying word to ears that waited in darkness for news of the White Council's work. The message it bore was simple. The southern fortress was abandoned. The White Council had played their hand, and the time of concealment was over. In Barad-dûr, the news was received with something that might have been satisfaction. The withdrawal from Dol Guldur had indeed been calculated, part of a strategy that stretched across centuries. The southern fortress had served its purpose, corrupting Mirkwood, dividing the forces of light, providing a visible target while the real work proceeded in secret. Now that work could continue without concealment, the armies of Mordor could march openly, the servants of Shadow could gather without fear of discovery, and the ancient alliances could be renewed without concern for watchers. The enemy had withdrawn, but withdrawal was not retreat. It was the drawing back of a great wave before it crashed upon the shore with force enough to reshape the very landscape. The White Council had won their battle, but in winning it, they had set in motion forces that would soon threaten to overwhelm all the defences of the free world. Sus on Section 18, Hope in Ashes. In the depths of winter, when the wind howled down from the grey mountains and snow lay deep upon the paths that led to Erebor, a small company gathered in the restored halls of the Lonely Mountain to mark the first anniversary of Smaug's death. The great dragon's bones had long since been cleared from the treasure chamber, but his shadow still lay heavy upon the land, visible in the blackened stone and twisted metal that spoke of fire hot enough to melt the very foundations of the earth. Yet for all the scars that remained, there was cause for celebration in those ancient halls. The forges burned bright once more, their flames casting dancing shadows on walls that had known only darkness for 60 years. The sound of hammer on anvil rang through chambers where silence had reigned supreme, and the voices of Durin's folk rose in songs that had not been heard since the days of their grandfathers' grandfathers. Thorin Oakenshield sat upon the throne of his ancestors, his dark hair now streaked with silver that spoke not of age, but of the weight of kingship borne well. The crown upon his brow had been reforged from gold taken from the dragon's hoard, its ancient runes speaking of oaths renewed and promises kept. But it was the smallest member of their company who drew the most attention on this night of remembrance. Bilbo Baggins had returned to Erebor for the anniversary, travelling from his comfortable hobbit hole through winter roads that would have daunted warriors twice his size. He looked older than his years, though whether from the weight of memory or some other burden none could say. His eyes held depths that had not been there before his adventure, and his hand would sometimes stray to his waistcoat pocket in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Master Baggins," Thorin said as the evening ceremonies drew to a close, "walk with me to the battlements. There is something I would discuss with you." They made their way through corridors that still bore the scars of dragonfire, past chambers where craftsmen worked day and night to restore the ancient beauty of the mountain's halls. The battlements offered a view that stretched from the desolation of the former battlefield to the lights of Dale twinkling in the distance like earthbound stars. "A year ago," Thorin said, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air, "we stood together in the dragon's lair and faced what seemed like certain death. Yet here we are, alive and victorious, with our enemies defeated and our homeland restored. It seems almost too good to be true." Bilbo nodded, though his attention seemed fixed not on the vista before them, but on something only he could see. "Too good to be true," he repeated softly. "Yes, I've had that feeling myself lately. As if we've won a battle but lost sight of the war, as if our victory was somehow permitted." The king's eyes sharpened at these words, for they echoed thoughts that had troubled his own sleep. Reports had reached them of strange stirrings in the lands beyond their borders, armies gathering in distant mountains, creatures that should have remained in darkness walking openly beneath the sky, whispers of a power in the east that grew stronger with each passing day. "You speak of things that others have only hinted at," Thorin said carefully. "Tell me plainly. What do you see that the rest of us have missed?" For a long moment Bilbo was silent, his eyes fixed upon the eastern horizon where clouds gathered like an advancing army. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of knowledge that he would have gladly been without. "I dream sometimes of a great eye opening in the darkness, of a voice that speaks with authority over all creatures that serve the shadow. In these dreams, I see our adventure not as we lived it, but as it appeared to one who watched from afar, a small move in a game whose scope we could not comprehend. He turned to face the king, and in his eyes Thorin saw something that chilled him more than the winter wind. We were meant to succeed, my lord. The dragon was meant to die. The mountain was meant to be reclaimed. But not for our sake, for the sake of one who needed the free peoples to taste victory before he crushed them utterly. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, carrying implications that neither wanted to acknowledge, but both knew to be true. Their great adventure, their triumph over impossible odds, all of it might have been nothing more than moves in a game played by a mind infinitely more subtle than their own. If that is so, Thorin said slowly, what do we do now? How do we turn the enemy's stratagem against him? Bilbo's hand moved to his pocket, fingers closing around something that pulsed with warmth despite the bitter cold. I don't know, he admitted, but I suspect the answer lies not in great deeds or mighty armies, but in small things, quiet courage, simple loyalty, the strength to do what is right even when the cost seems beyond bearing. He paused, his gaze turning inward as if he looked upon visions beyond the boundaries of the waking world. There is something I must tell you, something I have kept hidden, even from those I trust most. In the goblin tunnels, when we were separated, I found something that may prove more important than all the gold in your treasure chamber. The tale that followed, the story of the ring and its strange powers, of whispers in the darkness and dreams of dominion, chilled Thorin more than any winter wind. As Bilbo spoke, his voice growing quieter with each revelation, the king began to understand that their small company might indeed be called upon to play a part in events that would determine the fate of all Middle-earth. "This ring," Thorin said when the hobbit had finished, "you believe it to be more than it appears?" "I know it is," Bilbo replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes, when I wear it, I feel as though I am not alone, as if something vast and terrible looks through my eyes, speaks with my voice. It grows stronger with each passing day, more insistent in its whispers." The king studied his friend's face in the pale light of the winter stars, seeing there the marks of a burden that no hobbit should have been asked to bear. "What will you do with it?" "I don't know," Bilbo said again, and in those 3 words was contained all the uncertainty and fear that had haunted him since his return to the Shire. "Part of me wants to cast it into the deepest pit I can find, to be rid of its weight forever, but another part whispers that I might need it before the end, that its power might yet serve the cause of light." They stood together in silence after that, 2 small figures dwarfed by the immensity of the mountain and the greater immensity of the choices that lay before them. In the distance, Dale's lights continued to twinkle like stars brought down to earth, and from the halls below came the sound of celebration and the songs of a people who had reclaimed their ancient heritage. But beneath the joy and triumph, something else stirred, a sense of endings approaching, of tests yet to come that would make their battle with the dragon seem like a children's game by comparison. The prophecy that had set their feet upon the road to adventure was not yet fulfilled, and its final movement promised trials that would test not just their courage, but the very foundations of hope itself. As they made their way back to the warmth of the halls, both king and burglar carried with them the weight of knowledge that changed everything and nothing. They had won their victory, reclaimed their treasure, restored their kingdom. But the real war was only just beginning, and in that war, the fate of all free folk would hang upon the choices made by the smallest and most unlikely of heroes. In his pocket, the ring pulsed with warmth that had nothing to do with body heat, and in the darkness far to the east, a great eye opened wider and smiled. Epilogue. The first movement ends. Thus concludes the prophecy that predicted Smaug's awakening, the first movement in the great symphony of the War of the Ring. The dragon sleeps forever now in the desolation of his own making, the kingdom under the mountain stands restored, and the free peoples have tasted victory over the forces of shadow. But in the halls of Bag End, a simple golden ring waits in darkness, and the choices that its bearer makes in the days to come will determine whether the light endures or is forever extinguished by the returning shadow. The prophecy has been fulfilled, but its fulfillment has set in motion forces that will soon test the courage and wisdom of all who dwell beneath sun and stars. The first movement ends, but the symphony plays on, and its final chords will either ring with triumph or fade to silence in the darkness that has waited so long for its hour of dominion to come.